So as you may or may not know, that for the last 4 years I've been serving as one of the presidents of Churches Together in England. And one of the great things about being part of that body and being part of the 6 other presidents is just getting to know other people from very different traditions. In the flush of the youthfulness of our movements, we probably did believe the church began in 1975. Like the whole church. And suddenly you realize that there are people who have been around a lot longer. And maybe in our arrogance, we'd written off some of those people because of the tradition, because we were free and spontaneous and moved by the Spirit, and they had liturgy and were restricted by that, and we learned actually maybe they're not as restricted as we thought. And maybe we are more restricted than we thought. And so it's been great for me to get to know Archbishop Angaelos over these last 4 or 5 years, who is the Archbishop of London for the Coptic Orthodox Church. And he's been here since 1995 as a parish priest, and in 2017 was installed and enthroned as the Bishop of London. OBE in 2015 works a lot in reconciliation and the ecumenical world, and so it's a privilege and an honor and joy to have my friend, the Archbishop, with us here today. So let's welcome Archbishop Angaelos. I was going to list all the things that you chair or co-chair or founded, but it's like, go on Google and Wikipedia, you'll see them all there, so there's loads of them.
And I'm also hoping when Billy said we've been around for a lot longer, he wasn't talking about me personally. He was talking about my church. So.
And also, if you watch the Royal Wedding, you may have seen the Archbishop there.
Yeah, the hat gives it away.
So maybe first of all, Angaelos, let's talk about the Coptic Church. Not maybe here may know much about the Coptic Church, so tell us a bit about the church that you're a part of.
So many of you would be aware of the Greek Orthodox Church or Russian Orthodox Church. Coptic Orthodox, Coptic just means Egyptian. It comes from the Greek word Aegyptos, meaning Egypt. And the reason I explain that is that I was traveling to one of our churches once and stopped to refuel my car. And a scruffily dressed gentleman with a rucksack said, "Oh, good morning, Padre." And I said, "Oh, good morning." He said, "Which church do you belong to?" And I thought, it's far too early in the day to go through the whole Russian, Greek, Byzantine paradigm and trying to explain what Coptic is. I said, "I'm Egyptian Orthodox." He said, "Oh, so you're Coptic." Turned out he was a lapsed theologian. Not that there are many of those around, of course. So Coptic just means Egyptian. The church has been in Egypt for the past 2,000 years. Christianity was established in Egypt by St. Mark, the writer of the Gospel. Went into Egypt. And of course, Egypt was rich with the ancient Egyptian theology of a deity, of a trinity, of a judgment, of an afterlife. And so Christianity wasn't too far a stretch for them to understand these concepts. And as he went in to minister, his sandal strap broke. And so he went to the local cobbler. And as he was sewing his sandal strap, the awl went through his finger. And he said, "Oh, the one God." And of course, being an evangelical opportunist, as many of you are as well, he said, "Oh, what do you know about the one God? Who is the one God?" And from that conversation, it started out a conversation about Christ. And we've been there for 2,000 years. We've had long spates of persecution, whether it's Byzantium or Rome or the Ottoman period, entrance of Islam in the 7th century, and up until we just had the commemoration of the martyrdom of the 21 martyrs in Libya that many of you may have seen with those orange jumpsuits on the beach. And so we're still going through that, but it's a church of rich heritage and a blessing of persecution that sort of held it together.
And also across the world, there's quite a few Coptic Christians in different places.
Yes, so Coptic Orthodox, so Christians in Egypt represent about 15% of the population, about 15 million. And they're predominantly Orthodox, so probably 90% Orthodox. Outside of Egypt, we have about 1.5 to 2 million. So it's about 10% of the population outside. Biggest community in the US, and then in Canada and Australia. Here in the UK, we have about 20,000, served by about 33 parishes across the UK, across the 4 nations. I mean, sadly, although we represent 15% of the population of Egypt, the Christians in Egypt now represent about 80% of all the Christians in the Middle East. Oh, wow. Because so many people have left. So in somewhere like Iraq, where there were 2 million Christians 5 years ago, there are now about 150,000. Wow. Wow. And so on and so forth. And so Christians in Egypt remain as the large, significant block that is still there.
So it'd be good to hear a bit about your own journey, how you ended up coming into this ministry. You were born in Egypt yourself, but were brought up in Australia.
Born in Egypt, migrated with my family when I was 5 to Australia, lived my whole life in Australia, did my education there, worked, and then went back to Egypt to join the monastery. So the Coptic Orthodox Church is also where monastic life, lots of people over here as well, where monastic life started. St. Anthony the Great in the deserts of Egypt started monastic life in the 4th century. And so I feel a real connection when I see any nun or monk or brother or Franciscan friar walking down the street. We have common origins. And so I wanted to go back and join the monastery. So I did go back, joined the monastery in Egypt, was taken under the wing of the previous head of our church, the late Pope Shenouda, who took me on as his disciple and his spiritual son. I served as his private secretary for 6 years. Then he sent me to England. I've served here for 4 years as a monk priest. So our priests, by definition, our parish priests are ordained as married men, but our monks, of course, are celibate. But sometimes when there are small communities, we will send out monks to serve as monk priests. So I served as a monk priest for 4 years, became a general bishop or an undiocesan bishop in 1999, and then became Archbishop of London in 2017, as you said.
So what was that initial call? Obviously, you went through your education, you went to work, but what was the call of God for you into becoming a monk? What was the journey there?
Sometimes when we're trying to discern what God's done in our lives, it doesn't make sense at the time, but in retrospect, you see it all very clearly. So when I think about it now, it's all very clear. I can see what the preparation, how it happened. But at the time when I made the decision, I remember the instant. I mean, I didn't hear a voice, I didn't see an apparition, but I remember the very instant I decided. I had a book open, I was still studying. After I finished my first degree, I was doing another degree, closed the book, put it down by my side, and never looked back. And so my calling was to live in the desert for the rest of my life. And our monasteries are actually in the middle of the desert. But of course, anyone who's in ministry here understands that God has an incredible sense of humor. And so here I'm in Manchester. Nothing against Manchester, I'm just saying I'm not in the desert anymore.
Maybe a different type of desert.
Not touching that one.
I think, as I alluded to in our introduction, the thing that has really struck me is that sense of longevity. So I went to the cathedral when your Pope visited, and very strict social media guidelines that were announced at the beginning. No iPhones, no cameras. The procession started to come in. Everybody had their iPhone up, filming, taking photographs. And just the sense of being able to trace that succession back to St. Mark. And again, for our sort of churches, we can often feel the lack of that longevity. What do you think that does for you having that understanding of the depth of history.
When we speak about apostolic succession, it's the concept of I am able actually to trace my priesthood personally back to St. Mark and from him to Christ, because the person who ordained me was Pope Shenouda, one who ordained him was Pope Kyrillos, one who ordained him was Pope Euseb, and you actually can trace it back to the person until it goes back to Ananias, who goes back to St. Mark, who goes back being sent by Christ. And that in itself is an incredible feeling of being able to have that sense of connection. But I also am very wary never to use that as a point of arrogance, because I think for many of us, from the traditional historic churches, we can be seen as that is the only origin. And then from the newer churches, of the church started 50 years ago. And we both know that neither of those is true, because the church is a continuing entity. The church cannot be rigid. The church we speak about is the body of Christ. And the body must be alive and responsive, otherwise it's rigor mortis. If we're not responding, then we die. And by God's grace, of course, the church can't die because it is the body of Christ. But we can debilitate it quite significantly. And so for me, I think the ability to trace back my own monastic heritage, as I said, to the 4th century. The monastery that I'm from, St. Bishoy, is in a monastic area between Cairo and Alexandria, the Desert Highway. The monastery itself goes back to the 4th century, so I remember being there. There's a tunnel, and I was walking down this tunnel after I'd been in the monastery for about 5 years, and suddenly felt a shiver down my spine, because I realized that monks had been walking up and down this tunnel for 1,500 years. The very dirt that was there, the buildings, these stones have been there for that long. When we walk into Westminster, for instance, and you think the heritage that's there, multiply that by 5. And that's the sense of feeling you get. And it's a concept that we've been through so much. There has been so much against us, and yet for our church in particular, as Coptic Orthodox Church, it's still a living and breathing church. Our calendar starts in the year 284 AD. And that's not because we're slower than the rest of us, but it's because that was the beginning of the reign of Diocletian. And under Diocletian, we suffered the most horrific waves of persecution. We lost hundreds of thousands, if not millions. His armies would go into cities and villages and kill every man, woman, and child just because they were Christians. And yet we're still here. And yet we're still alive. And yet we're still tell the tale. And when I'm asked, so, with all of this persecution going on, do you think Christians will continue to exist in the Middle East? And I said, if we've outlived Diocletian, then we'll outlive this, because this is part of the cross we carry. So it's that history of struggle and witness and faithfulness that really makes it worthwhile.
When I asked you the question about the 21 martyrs that were killed in Libya, that was your response to me, that put everything into perspective. That and you said, if we can survive the Diocletian persecution, we will survive this. Which again, I think just that sense of the longevity enables you to live in that. So you've been in the UK now since 1995. What would be some of your observations about the church, the nature of society, how you see things developing spiritually, church-wise, more broadly?
I think society is definitely more confused and fragmented, partially because of such a rapid escalation of things, whether it's gender identity, whether it's social media and how we propagate facts and news and fake news. And so that's definitely a challenge. People's realities have changed. So reality is no longer just reality, it's perception. So if your Twitter feed says something, that suddenly becomes your reality, whether it's true or not. Whereas before, I think we were able to digest and process information and then pick and choose what we accept or don't accept. Whereas now, it is so quick, it's relentless, that all we do is accept what we see and we absorb it. And I think that changes the concept of reality. As far as the church is concerned, I think the church is now stronger. Now, I think there are lots of prophets of doom out there who tell you that the church is weaker and the church has less relevance. I see something totally different. I mean, the fact that, and I must say, Billy did all of you such a great honor being one of the presidents of CTE. He was a voice of truth and a voice of, a brave voice and a clear voice. And the number of times we have stood absolutely side by side and shoulder to shoulder on a variety of issues shows that, although we may be at very different ends of a continuum of the Christian family, and yet there are some very core elements at which we stand absolutely united. So we had such a great ambassador, and the proof of that is that as CTE, we're having such a horrible time trying to find a replacement. He's put us into a huge problem. But I think in seeing that sense of coming together, whether it's our relationship with the various parts of the body. I was attending Church of England General Synod last week, and now I'm here with you, and I do a variety of things, and it's all very seamless. I don't feel foreign at all being here. I don't feel like I don't belong, and a big part of that is because of your wonderful smiling faces and hospitality as soon as I walked in, but also it's because I'm amongst brothers and sisters. And I do feel that the manifestation of the broader face of the church makes it much stronger. And what we need to continue to do is to be relevant and legitimate. Because the biggest problem we suffer as church now is relevance. People will tell us we're not, but we know we very well are. And that's what we need to continue to struggle towards.
I know you've been a great advocate of ecumenical friendship, and you sit on various boards and reconciliation. I think that's been a great testimony to you reaching out, and we so appreciate that invitation and that inclusiveness and welcome. Is there anything that you have an opportunity to speak to 350 leaders of newer churches? What would you like to encourage us with as we move forward in this coming year and years?
First of all, I want to thank you because you are all in ministry and you all serve and you all lead. And as much as we'd like to think we can all be our own people in ministry, we know that the model that Christ himself established was one of leadership and discipleship and mentoring. And I think having leaders is very important. But it's also in the leadership of the footsteps of Christ. Leading by example, leading graciously, leading lovingly. So I want to thank you for everything you're doing. And I'm sure you're doing wonderful things amongst your own communities. But also thank you on behalf of the wider church, because I think what we do together is very, very important. And it's groundbreaking. We can certainly focus on what separates us, but that doesn't do anybody any good. We definitely know there are things that separate us, but they don't stop us being in the same room here and praying together and witnessing together out in the street, because this fellowship goes beyond and goes out there. The second thing is, as I said earlier, be encouraged. Don't believe. I do a lot of ecumenical work, and I do a lot of publicly facing work as Billy does. Don't believe that the church is weaker today, because it's not. We need to own that space, and we need to own the reality of who we are and how effective we are. And we need to realize that power is not necessarily in numbers. It is in effect and witness. The smallest candle breaks the greatest darkness. And when you get lots of candles together, we break a lot of darkness. And so I think that's very important. What I would encourage you to do is, if you haven't visited a church from another tradition, please do so. And one indictment of our work, I think, especially with such a huge focus on interreligious dialogue since 2001 and September 11, is that we will go into mosques and synagogues and other places of worship to express our fellowship with people, but we will not visit our sisters and brothers in other denominations and expressions. And so please do that. And you'll realize that people aren't as different as you think. And there is a commonality, and there is an identifiable unity that we have. And finally, I think we are very blessed and fortunate to be in a nation, a country where we can worship freely. Whereas when we're talking about Egypt, but more so around the Middle East, because we're holding our own. You know, when you combine Christian resilience with pharaonic arrogance, you get a pretty unbreakable people. And I think, you know, we're not going anywhere. We're fine. We're under pressure, but we're fine. But when you look at the rest of the Middle East, definitely, I'm in my own church, of course, but definitely across the Middle East are in need of our prayers. Just because we haven't read today that someone has died for his or her faith doesn't mean that someone has not died for his or her faith. Just because we don't hear of a persecuted community doesn't mean there isn't a community being persecuted. So don't just be led by the top story on your news feed. I think be very conscious and aware that while we are here, able to meet very freely and openly, there are many who can't even do this safely. They will still do it, but they can't do it safely. And so continue to pray. And of course, I've always said we need to lose this concept of a church of the East and church of the West. There's only one body of Christ. And it's not separated into East and West. It's just separated into lots of members across the world, all worshiping and witnessing in their own ways. And so remember that you are part of something much, much bigger, and it doesn't have to look like you. But it is something much, much bigger nonetheless, and that's what we work towards. You know, the reason I do ecumenism is not because it's cool, it's not because it's fashionable, because I don't think it's fashionable anymore. I do it because I believe in what our Lord said, that there will be one flock for one shepherd. Now, it probably won't be in my lifetime, but it doesn't mean we can't contribute towards it. You know, I was meeting with a Middle East church leader years back, and we're talking about the Council of Chalcedon. For those of you who don't know, 451 is when we were pushed out as being heretics because we believed in only one nature of Christ. So we profess both the humanity and divinity in one inseparable nature. And so I'm not sure which one we're meant to deny, but we then ended up realizing it was a matter of semantics and definition. And he said, you know, we find it very difficult to forgive Chalcedon because through the ecumenical divide, which was deeply politicized at the time, that's what brought in various empires. That's what made us rely on you know, the Muslim empires to protect us. And that's what made Islam enter into the Middle East and change the Middle East. That's historic. That's done. What I don't want is in 100 years for people to come back and say, you know, because you were aggressively divided today, that we've made things worse for them in 100 years' time. So we need to realize there are implications to our actions beyond what we can see, both in our own communities, but also over time.
Archbishop Angaelos. Now, Archbishop Angaelos is going to be meeting at lunchtime with the 20s and 30s. If you want to sneak in, then I'm sure that would be possible. I'm getting no one going There may not be any lunch for you. That's the only thing. Okay, good. So you can sneak in, but no, there's no lunch. So that'll be, where's that going to be, Ryan? Room 1. Seminar room 1. That's downstairs. Great. Well, we would like to use this opportunity to pray, particularly for the Persecuted Church. Linda Ward, as part of our core team, traveled to Korea with Open Doors last year and was very impacted by her visit there. And so I think we just thought, while you're with us, it'd be good to pray for the church in nations that don't have the freedom that we have.
Can I say one thing before you pray? Never feel sorry for what we call the persecuted church. We are not victims. We are witnesses. And so give thanks for the witness, but don't ever feel sorry for anyone carrying the cross of Christ.